How does a hero become a monster? We remember the photographs. The Yankee Clipper kissing his Hollywood bride. A fairy tale romance for a nation hungry for myths. But what really happened on the cold Los Angeles night of November 5, 1954, when Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra kicked down a stranger's door, convinced they would find Marilyn Monroe in another man's bed? This was not a mistake. It was a mission. And it wasn't the tragic end of a love story. It was the moment the mask of a national icon was ripped away, revealing the cold, possessive rage of a man who believed he owned the most desired woman in the world and would destroy anything, or anyone, to prove it. The year was 1954, a year that began with a wedding and was ending with a war. The marriage, a collision of two American empires, had lasted a mere 274 days. The press called it a tragedy of schedules, of conflicting careers. The truth, as always, was written in the bruises and the tears that never made it to print. Marilyn had filed for divorce on grounds of mental cruelty just 1 month earlier, on October 6. The legal papers were a sterile, bloodless account of a union that had become a prison. The breaking point had been a gust of wind from a New York City subway grate. That iconic image, her white dress billowing upwards, a moment of pure cinematic ecstasy for the world, was a moment of profound humiliation for her husband. He saw not art, but exhibitionism. He saw not his wife, but his property, on display for the leering crowds. The argument that night, back in their hotel room, was said to have been violent, a brutal culmination of months of simmering jealousy and control. She had made her choice. She wanted out. But for Joe DiMaggio, the divorce papers were not an ending. They were an insult, a challenge. In his world, a world of baseball diamonds and clear-cut victories, you didn't just lose, you were beaten, and he refused to be beaten by her. He retreated into a fog of suspicion, a dark paranoia that consumed him. He was convinced she had been unfaithful, that her desire for freedom was merely a cover for her desire for other men. The press might have moved on, but Joe had not. He wasn't her husband anymore. He was her hunter. He wasn't hunting alone. His chief accomplice was a man who understood the dark underbelly of fame and obsession better than anyone. Frank Sinatra. Blue Eyes was nursing his own wounds, fresh from his tumultuous divorce from Ava Gardner. He saw in Joe a kindred spirit, another titan brought low by a goddess he couldn't tame. Their shared pain curdled into a toxic alliance, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride in the dim light of Hollywood bars. They were the lonely gods of the mid-century, and they believed the heavens still owed them fealty. This vendetta needed a professional touch, so they hired one. His name was Barney Ruditsky, a celebrated and feared ex-NYPD detective turned high-priced Hollywood private eye. Ruditsky was the man you called when you needed secrets unearthed, preferably with a photograph to prove it. He assembled a team, a small crew of stake-fed gumshoes, who specialized in the sordid business of extramarital surveillance. They began trailing Marilyn's car, tapping her friends for information, listening. Always listening. This was no longer about a broken heart. It was about evidence. It was a cold, calculated operation to catch Marilyn in a compromising position, to gather leverage, to win the public war of the divorce by painting her not as a victim escaping a controlling marriage, but as a deceitful adulteress. DiMaggio wasn't just trying to heal his pride. He was trying to destroy her reputation. The love had died. What remained was a scorched earth policy of possession. The call came on the evening of November 5th. A tip. Ruditsky's informant network had delivered the jackpot. A singer named Sheila Stewart, a friend of Marilyn's, had supposedly seen her entering an apartment building at number 8122 Waring Avenue in Hollywood. And she wasn't alone. The informant was certain. This was it. The moment of truth. The climax of weeks of stalking and suspicion. The trap was set. DiMaggio and Sinatra mobilized instantly. They met Ruditsky and his partner, a man named Philip Irwin, on a dark corner near the location. The air was cold, thick with anticipation. You could almost feel the energy pulsing between them. DiMaggio's coiled, silent rage, Sinatra's agitated, nervous excitement. They were a posse, riding through the canyons of Hollywood not on horseback but in a Cadillac, on their way to serve their own brutal form of frontier justice. They parked down the street, killing the engine and the headlights, melting into the suburban quiet. Ruditsky's men had the building staked out. They pointed to a ground-floor apartment, Unit 101. The lights were on. Muffled sounds could be heard from within. Music. Perhaps a voice. For DiMaggio, every shadow in the window was a confirmation of his deepest fears. He had her cornered. The plan was simple and brutally efficient. Ruditsky and his men would set up the camera equipment. They needed a shot, a single, damning photograph that would prove his case. They would all go to the door, and on DiMaggio's signal, They would go in fast, overwhelm them before they had time to react, to dress, to hide the truth. Sinatra, ever the showman, reportedly brought a flask. This was a spectator sport for him. For Joe, it was an execution. They crept across the manicured lawn, their footsteps swallowed by the night. A few of the men went around to cover the back windows, ensuring there was no escape. DiMaggio, Sinatra, Ruditsky, and Irwin approached the front door of apartment 101. They stood there for a moment, listening. The soft sound of a radio played from inside. It was a serene, domestic sound, a grotesque counterpoint to the violence about to be unleashed. DiMaggio didn't knock. There was no warning. There was only the primal, explosive command from him. Now! He threw his legendary weight against the door, but it was Ruditsky, the professional, who delivered the decisive blow. He drew his foot back and kicked, not at the lock, but just beside it, splintering the wood of the door jamb with a sound like a gunshot in the silent Hollywood night. The door flew open. They poured inside, a tidal wave of masculine fury. DiMaggio in the lead, his eyes scanning the room, hunting for his prey. Ruditsky's partner fumbled with the flashbulbs on his camera, ready to immortalize the sin. They burst through the small living room and into the bedroom, the sanctum they had come to violate. They were ready for a scene of passion, of betrayal. They were ready for Marilyn. They were not ready for Florence Coates. The woman in the bedroom wasn't a blonde bombshell. She was a 37-year-old secretary, startled from her sleep, alone. She screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror, as four large men, strangers, burst into her private space. The camera flash popped, bathing the scene in a momentary, horrifying blast of white light, capturing not a lover's tryst, but the terrified face of an innocent victim in her own home. Confusion, panic, the adrenaline of the hunt curdled into the sickening acid of a colossal mistake. This wasn't Marilyn's apartment. This wasn't her lover. This was nothing. They had stormed the wrong address. They had kicked down the wrong door. The great Joe DiMaggio, the heroic Yankee Clipper, stood frozen in the bedroom of a terrified stranger, his righteous crusade revealed for what it was: a pathetic, violent, and illegal home invasion. They fled. As quickly as they had arrived, they scrambled out of the apartment, leaving a splintered door and a traumatized woman in their wake. They piled back into their cars and screeched away into the darkness, the entire sordid affair lasting less than 5 minutes. They thought they could erase it, that the silence of the night would swallow their crime. They were wrong. Florence Coates, though terrified, was not silent. She called the police. The story broke almost immediately, but the Hollywood machine, the powerful network of publicists and studio fixers, went into overdrive. The narrative was spun instantly. It wasn't a violent break-in. It was a raid. It wasn't a terrifying ordeal for an innocent woman. It was a comedy of errors. The press, complicit in the star-making system, played along. They painted DiMaggio as a pining, lovesick fool, a jealous husband whose heart simply got the better of him. It was a charming, forgivable mistake. Frank Sinatra's involvement was minimized, almost erased from the initial reports. Barney Ruditsky, the professional enabler, faded back into the shadows. The world laughed at the story of the wrong door, but they were all asking the wrong question. The papers were obsessed with how the heroes could have made such a foolish blunder. No one was asking what would have happened if they had kicked down the right door. What violence was DiMaggio prepared to unleash on Marilyn herself? The splintered wood of Florence Coates's apartment was a testament to his rage, a preview of a tragedy that was only averted by a simple clerical error. But the biggest secret of that night was not in the apartment they broke into. It was in the one they didn't. While DiMaggio and Sinatra were creating a criminal farce on Waring Avenue, Marilyn Monroe was miles away, safe. She was with a friend, listening to records, completely unaware of the posse that was hunting her. Or was she? The informant's tip had been specific. Sheila Stewart, her supposed friend, had sent them on a wild goose chase, sending them to the apartment right next door to where she herself lived. It was a deliberate misdirection, a setup. But for whose benefit? To humiliate Joe? Or to protect Marilyn? As the dust settled and the lawyers began to circle, a far more intriguing possibility began to surface. Marilyn hadn't just been lucky that night. She had been warned. Someone in that tight circle of conspirators, someone close to the operation, had picked up a phone and betrayed DiMaggio. Someone had told Marilyn that the hunters were on their way, giving her just enough time to disappear before the door came crashing down. The raid was a spectacular failure because it had been sabotaged from the inside. The question was no longer where Marilyn was. The question was, who was her guardian angel? The question was no longer where Marilyn was. The question was, who was her guardian angel? To answer that, we have to look past the lovesick baseball hero and at the other man in that car. The man who orchestrated the entire evening. The man with the connections, the power, and the ice-cool demeanor. The chairman of the board himself, Frank Sinatra. For decades, the story has been that Frank was just along for the ride, helping his heartbroken pal Joe. But what if that was the greatest performance of his career? What if Sinatra wasn't DiMaggio's accomplice? What if he was Marilyn's savior? Think about it. Why would Sinatra, a man whose entire career was built on a carefully cultivated image of cool control, get involved in such a sloppy, amateurish, and incredibly risky escapade? He was at the peak of his power. He had just won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity. He was the king of Hollywood. A messy scandal involving a home invasion and a potential assault charge could have destroyed everything. Was he really that loyal to the increasingly erratic and possessive DiMaggio? Or was he playing a different game entirely? Some biographers and insiders have suggested a shocking alternative: that Sinatra intentionally sabotaged the raid from the very beginning. He saw his friend descending into a dangerous obsession. He knew DiMaggio's rage was a loaded gun, and he had no intention of being there when it went off. So he made a call, or had someone else make a call, a quiet warning to Marilyn, giving her a head start. He then proceeds with the raid, knowing it will fail, allowing Joe to vent his fury on an empty room and a splintered door, but preventing a genuine catastrophe. In this version of the story, Sinatra isn't a mindless thug. He's a chess master, moving his pieces across the board, protecting the queen from a raging king. But if Sinatra's betrayal saved Marilyn from a physical confrontation, it couldn't save anyone from the legal one that was about to erupt. The victim of the Wrong Door raid, Florence Coots, was not a Hollywood insider. She was an ordinary citizen, and she was rightly horrified by what had happened. She didn't care that her attacker was a baseball legend. She didn't care that his accomplice was the most famous singer in the world. Her home had been violated. She had been terrorized, and she wanted justice. She filed a lawsuit for $200,000 against the entire crew, citing forcible entry, invasion of privacy, and severe mental anguish. Suddenly, this comedy of errors was a serious legal matter, and with a lawsuit comes a wonderful, terrible thing called discovery. It meant sworn depositions. It meant everyone involved had to sit down, under oath, and tell their side of the story. The bright lights of the camera flash were replaced by the cold, unflinching glare of legal scrutiny, and the stories began to unravel. DiMaggio, in his deposition, tried to play the part of the concerned husband. He claimed he had received information that Marilyn was ill, possibly in the company of people who were giving her narcotics. He testified that he was merely trying to stage a rescue. The door, he claimed, just gave way under his push. It was a flimsy, pathetic defense. The violent splintering of the door jamb told a very different story. He painted himself as a white knight, but the evidence painted him as a home invader. Sinatra's testimony was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. He was just there for his friend, he said. He claimed he stayed outside, near the cars, and had no part in breaking down the door. He was just a bystander, a designated driver for a friend's emotional crisis. He skillfully distanced himself from the violence, from the decision-making, from the crime itself. He was just Frank, helping out his pal Joe. Under the pressure of legal questioning, the posse of friends fractured. It was every man for himself. And then there was Marilyn. The lawsuit gave her the one thing she desperately needed: a public, legally documented record of Joe's terrifying behavior. She was in the middle of divorce proceedings, fighting to escape the marriage. Her initial claim was based on mental cruelty, a vague and often difficult-to-prove accusation. But now, she had the ultimate Exhibit A. The Wrong Door raid was no longer a tabloid joke. It was the centerpiece of her divorce case. It was proof, undeniable and spectacular, of the very mental cruelty she was trying to describe. It was evidence of his jealousy, his possessiveness, and his capacity for violence. In her own sworn affidavit, Marilyn didn't have to exaggerate. She just had to tell the truth. She described Joe's controlling nature, his simmering anger, his fits of jealous rage. She detailed how he hated her career, how he despised the people she worked with, how he wanted to isolate her and turn her into a simple housewife. The raid, she argued, was the logical, terrifying conclusion to his escalating obsession. It was the act of a man who believed he owned her, who believed he had the right to literally break down doors to get to her. The judge agreed. On October 27, 1954, less than a month after the raid, Marilyn Monroe was granted a divorce from Joe DiMaggio. Their marriage had lasted only 274 days. In the courtroom, she was a picture of quiet dignity. But the raid had given her more than just a legal victory. It had given her leverage. It had given her a voice. The men who had set out that night to catch her, to trap her, had instead handed her the keys to her own freedom. She hadn't been a pawn in their game. She had been the one, in the end, who had checkmated the king. For Joe DiMaggio, the fallout was catastrophic. He didn't just lose his wife, he lost his aura. The American hero, the stoic, dignified Yankee Clipper, was now publicly seen as a bully and a stalker. The man who once commanded universal respect was now the butt of a national joke. The raid stripped away his legend and exposed the flawed, angry man beneath. He had tried to reclaim his wife through force, and in doing so, he had ensured he would never get her back. The silence he had once cultivated as a sign of strength now seemed like the sullen silence of a bitter, defeated man. Sinatra, on the other hand, emerged almost completely unscathed. His lawyers, his publicists, his sheer force of will insulated him from the worst of the scandal. While Joe's reputation was being torn to shreds, Frank's only grew. He was seen as loyal, if a bit reckless, a guy's guy. The incident added a hint of dangerous glamour to his persona. He had walked right up to the edge of a career-ending disaster, stared into the abyss, and strolled away without a single scratch. It cemented his reputation as Teflon Frank, the ultimate survivor. But it also raised a chilling question. If he was willing to betray his supposed best friend to save himself, or to protect Marilyn, what else was he capable of? Marilyn was free, but the scars of that night and that marriage remained. The raid became a defining moment in her mythology. It was the ultimate example of the toxic masculinity that surrounded her, the obsessive need for men to possess and control her, as if she were a beautiful object rather than a human being. She had escaped DiMaggio's cage, but she had flown directly into the turbulent winds of global superstardom, a storm that would offer its own kind of dangers. She had won the battle, but the war for her own soul was far from over. And what of Florence Kotz, the innocent woman at the center of this celebrity cyclone? The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. DiMaggio and Sinatra paid her a sum of $7,500, a paltry amount for the terror they had inflicted. She took the money and faded back into the anonymity from which she had been so violently wrenched. Her story serves as a stark reminder that behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood legends are real people, whose lives can be shattered by the reckless whims of the rich and famous. Her splintered door is a monument to the collateral damage of celebrity obsession. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because even after the divorce, after the lawsuits, and the public humiliation, Joe DiMaggio never truly let Marilyn go. His obsession didn't vanish. It just went underground. It festered. He watched her from afar, through the papers and the newsreels, as she married the playwright Arthur Miller, as her fame reached astronomical heights, as her personal struggles deepened. He saw the world that he believed had corrupted her continue to chew her up, and he waited. This obsessive, possessive love would be tragically reframed years later. After her death, it was DiMaggio who claimed her body. It was DiMaggio who arranged her funeral, famously banning the Hollywood elite, including Frank Sinatra, from attending. He blamed them, he blamed the Kennedys, he blamed the entire system for destroying the woman he loved. For 20 years after her death, he had a dozen red roses delivered to her grave, 3 times a week. A final, mournful, and deeply unsettling act of devotion. Was it the gesture of a truly repentant and heartbroken man? Or was it the last possessive act of a man who could only truly have her when she was gone? And what about the man who allegedly saved her that night? Frank Sinatra. His relationship with Marilyn, both before and after the raid, remains one of Hollywood's most debated mysteries. Were they just friends? Were they occasional lovers? Or was there something deeper? Sinatra introduced her to the Rat Pack. He introduced her to Pat Lawford, the sister of John F. Kennedy. In doing so, he opened a door for Marilyn into a world of glamour and political power that was even more dangerous than DiMaggio's jealous rages. This leads us to the most disturbing possibility of all. What if Sinatra's phone call wasn't an act of friendship? What if it wasn't self-preservation? What if it was a calculated move in a much larger game? By saving Marilyn from Joe, he didn't just earn her gratitude, he earned her trust. He subtly removed DiMaggio, the jealous protector, from her life, leaving her more vulnerable, more isolated, and more dependent on new friends. Friends like him. Did Sinatra save Marilyn from one monster, only to deliver her into the hands of others? Or perhaps into his own? The Wrong Door raid wasn't the end of a story of obsession. It was the beginning of a whole new chapter, one that would lead Marilyn down a path of political intrigue, dangerous liaisons, and ultimately, to her final, tragic end. The splintered wood of Florence Kotz's door wasn't just evidence of a marriage's end. It was a crossroads in the life of Marilyn Monroe, a violent turn that sent her hurtling toward a destiny that was perhaps even darker than the one she had just escaped. But to truly understand that destiny, we have to look again at the night of the raid, and ask a question that has been lurking in the shadows for decades. Was Joe DiMaggio really the one in charge? Think about the man DiMaggio hired to orchestrate it all. Private investigator Barney Ruditsky. He wasn't just some gumshoe for hire. He was a former cop with a reputation and a very long list of powerful and often dangerous connections. Is it possible that Joe, in his desperate, jealous rage, was merely a pawn, a convenient and highly emotional front for a far more calculated operation? What if the raid was never truly about catching Marilyn in the act? What if the real target was Sinatra? Or what if the goal was simply to gain leverage, a piece of dirty laundry on two of the biggest stars in the world, to be used later by unseen players? The wrong door wasn't just a mistake. It may have been the most brilliant part of the plan. A simple, violent act of domestic espionage becomes a potential linchpin in a shadow war for influence, fought in the backrooms of Washington and the nightclubs of Vegas. By hitting the wrong door, the operation failed in its stated goal. But it may have succeeded in a far more important one. It created chaos. And in chaos, there is opportunity. Opportunity for powerful entities, like J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, to gather leverage. Opportunity for the mob to pull strings. Opportunity for political dynasties to neutralize threats before they even materialize. In this version of the story, Joe DiMaggio is the perfect cover. A jilted husband whose explosive and predictable jealousy could be easily aimed like a weapon. Frank Sinatra isn't the rescuer. He's the extractor, the operative sent to pull a high-value asset, Marilyn, from an unstable situation and deliver her into a new circle of influence. The raid wasn't to catch her with another man. It was to sever her from the one man who, for all his monstrous possessiveness, might have kept her away from dangers far greater than himself. The splintered wood of apartment 13 at 8122 Kilkea Drive is more than just collateral damage. It is the sound of a carefully constructed dam breaking. The flood that followed would carry Marilyn Monroe into the arms of the Rat Pack, onto the yacht of a president, and into the crosshairs of the most powerful and paranoid men in America. Every subsequent tragedy, every secret, every hushed-up affair, and every desperate phone call in the final years of her life can be traced back to this one violent, chaotic night. The night she was saved. That door wasn't just the wrong door for Joe DiMaggio. In the end, it was the wrong door for Marilyn Monroe. It opened not into a stranger's bedroom, but onto a dark boulevard from which there was no return. A path paved with flashbulbs and secrets, leading inexorably toward a lonely bungalow in Brentwood, and a legend that would forever be shrouded in the question, what was the truth? A truth that, perhaps, was never meant to be found. The myths of Hollywood are etched in stone, but the truth is written in sand, washed away by the tides of time. But some stories demand to be told. To uncover more secrets buried beneath the iconic sign, subscribe to Boulevard_of_Monroe. The ghosts are waiting,